All right, this video is going to be a short introduction and discussion about central processing units or CPUs. And that leads me into my first question is, what is a CPU and why is it important? Well, the central processing unit is the brains of the computer. It is where all calculations are done. It's where all manipulations are done. So the CPU, it truly just does simple math, but through complex programming, we make that simple math work out to be worksheets and words and slides and databases and even video games. But every calculation is done within the CPU. So your CPU is important. And the speed of that CPU determines how much you can actually do with that CPU. So primarily, there are two companies that produce CPUs for everything except Apple. Those two companies are Intel, which makes them a lion's share, and AMD, the other company. So Intel and AMD, they make pretty much the majority of computers or CPUs worldwide. There are some smaller companies, but the process to make a CPU is so complex and requires the ability to grow crystals in a lab, or silicon wafers. It requires the ability to be in a complete dust-free environment. Setting up an operation that sort requires a lot of money. So a lot of companies but have fallen out. And to get into the game, you'd have to have a lot of money, which brings us to our third company, which is Apple. Prior to last year, all of Apple's CPUs were made by Intel, or the vast majority. Again, there's always little offshoots, but the vast majority were made by Intel. Apple wanted to do a different architecture for their CPU, and you don't have to worry about what that architecture is. So it has started making its own CPUs. So let's talk about processor speed. What determines processor speed? Well, processor speed is done by something called flops. So I'm going to go here to processor speed is determined in flops. So a flop is a floating operation point per second measure, and it determines how fast the computer actually goes. It is the operations that it can perform in a single second, which is a lot, because right now we're working in petaflops, and you'll see now we talk about teraflops. And let's go to a petaflop, or we can go to a teraflop, that's fine. So a teraflop is 12 trillion operations in a second. 12 trillion. Now think about that. It's a lot of zeros. And this is when here's talking about Xbox, and I just randomly do it. So we talk about flops as the ability for a processor to perform operations. So that's pretty much how speed is determined, is how fast it can do. So socket type. Now sockets, and here I'm going to actually use a link off the document that I have here, and it's Wikipedia. I know people don't like Wikipedia, but Wikipedia has some really great uses if used wisely. And this is one of the best places I've ever found for sockets, because this Wikipedia article deals with the majority of sockets. For those of you who didn't see that on the web, I'll go back there. It's just the CPU socket entry. So what I'm going to do is go down a socket. There are many types of socket. A socket is just like at your home, what you plug into. There are different types. You can plug in one thing to one, but not to another. You can go to Europe, and you can't plug anything here. So a socket is in your computer, and it holds the CPU. And this is a very old socket, and one of the newer sockets. Sockets get extreme; they vary. Now, what is a socket? It's what holds the CPU. And why is it important? Because you're limited. Only so many CPUs fit in each type of socket. So over the years, there's been a ton of sockets. Socket 7 was really popular when I first bought my really first home computer to go crazy. And it held 3 different types of CPUs, which means I was rocking. I could upgrade it. So you're limited by the type of CPU it can hold and the ability to upgrade. So that Socket 7 was great, but later on, it wouldn't hold the things I really wanted. So I had to buy a whole new computer. That socket is built generally onto the motherboard. And in order to upgrade, if that socket won't hold what you want, you have to buy a whole new motherboard. Usually that means a whole new computer. We've moved along, and that's why I like this Wikipedia page. We've moved along a lot. So let's go here. So that's why socket is important. It limits the number of CPUs you can actually use on that motherboard. What does the term dual core mean? Well, there's a gentleman called Moore, and he made a paper. And this paper became to be known as Moore's Law. And Moore's Law said that processor speed doubled every year. So it exponentially got larger. Actually, doubled every, I think, 3 or 7 years. I don't remember the exact number. I apologize. Well, they came to a point where they were making literally the threads in a processor and a CPU are 1 atom in thickness. They can't really make it any thinner than that. So they said, we've reached the limit of our ability to do processing. So we've come to the end of Moore's Law. And somebody said, well, that's great. We'll just stack 2 of them together. That way we get all the same stuff, but we get more processor power. And they did it. So now we have dual cores and we have quad cores, which literally means inside of that one piece that we call a CPU, there's actually multiple CPUs just stacked on top of each other. And that's called an architecture. So dual core means we have more than one processor working in there. So in my classroom, we have some computers we use, and they have an Intel 86E5300 processor. Why do I have them? Because the school is getting rid of them, and I can use them. So to find out the information on that, I just go to Google, and I'm going to look up the Intel section because that's where I really want to go. That's where Intel was. And I come up with all the stats for my processor. I love Google when used well. So it says, what is the speed and socket type? So because I went to Intel, I got to the page that talked about it, said it's an old legacy, meaning old. I'm a legacy teacher, old. So when you'll see that this CPU, a couple important things come out of this thing. It says it came out in the first quarter of 08, so somewhere early in the spring of 2008. It tells us the speed. And that speed is given at a couple things. Generally, bus speed is not what you're working for. Generally, when we talk about the speed of a processor, as users, we don't use the term flops. We actually talk about base frequency speed, which is 2.60 gigahertz. So it's a pretty fast speed back then. Most of the video games now at 2.6 gigahertz will not function well. So that's the speed. And then down here, I found the sockets say it's an LGA 775. So my socket is an LGA 775 that will hold these processors. So the real question comes is I've got this computer and it has a socket with an LGA 775. If I want to upgrade my processor, it has to fit in that socket. So it will come back to that Wikipedia page, and here's the LGA 775 socket. And it came out in 2004, and these 8 right here are the only types of chips I can plug into it, which means I have a 2-core system, and if you read on that, it said, oh, where did I go right there? It said right up here, the number of cores in that socket were 2. So I have a 2-core system. I can look down and see exactly how many I can buy that'll fit that. That's this right here. There's the E8, E7. And it tells me how great can I get at speed. And I'm limited really to just that kind of computers. I really can't get any more above that. All right, so that was a short intro into sockets. Here are some of the links for some of the other stuff I used. I love Computer Hope. That's just a wink out to them because they talk English about high technical stuff without going super geeky. I hope that helps. Get that done, turned in. Bye.